Sugar and spice and everything not so nice. Between 1400 and 1800, European food changed as dramatically as Europe's connections with the wider world. Sugar, spices, coffee, tea and tobacco moved from being rare luxuries to increasingly important parts of European life. But these new tastes were not simply the result of cultural exchange. They were tied to expanding trade networks, colonial conquest, plantations and systems of forced labor that connected Europe, Africa, Asia and the Americas. Europe was not simply discovering new foods. It was developing systems capable of moving calories, stimulants, luxuries, and human beings across oceans on an unprecedented scale. Sugar crosses the Atlantic. For most Europeans in the early 1400s, concentrated sweetness was relatively rare. Honey, fruit and dried fruit provided sweetness, while refined sugar remained an expensive luxury. Sugarcane had a long history before it ever reached Europe. The plant was domesticated and developed through regions including New Guinea and Southeast Asia before spreading westward through India, the Islamic world and eventually the Mediterranean. By the medieval period, Europeans had learned to cultivate and process sugarcane in suitable Mediterranean regions. But production remained limited, and sugar was still largely a luxury. That changed when European expansion crossed the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus carried sugarcane to the Caribbean during his second voyage in 1493. Portuguese colonists developed large-scale sugar production in Brazil during the 16th century, while Spanish, French, English and Dutch colonizers established plantations throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. The tropical climate was ideal for sugarcane. The problem was labor. Sugarcane was extraordinarily demanding. Fields had to be planted and maintained. Mature cane had to be cut by hand, transported rapidly to mills and crushed. The juice then had to be boiled and processed before it spoiled. Producing sugar on a large scale required enormous amounts of labor. Plantation owners therefore sought a vast and inexpensive workforce. They found it through one of the most brutal systems in human history: the transatlantic slave trade. Plantations and slavery. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Men, women and children were separated from their families and communities, and sold into slavery in the Americas. Many died during capture, imprisonment, or the Atlantic crossing. Those who survived were subjected to systems that legally treated human beings as property. Sugar plantations became one of the major destinations for enslaved Africans. This was not a system created by one country. Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France and Britain all participated in the Atlantic slave trade and colonial plantation economy, although their roles changed over time. Portuguese Brazil became one of the world's great sugar-producing regions. Spanish colonies used enslaved Africans in plantations, mines and other forms of colonial production. Dutch merchants and companies became deeply involved in the slave trade and established their own Caribbean colonies. France developed enormously profitable sugar plantations in places such as Saint-Domingue, Martinique and Guadeloupe. Britain eventually became a dominant force in both the slave trade and the Caribbean plantation economy. European merchants, shipowners, investors and governments participated in a commercial system that generated enormous wealth. And at the other end of that system was the European consumer. A household purchasing sugar for a pastry, preserve or cup of tea might be thousands of miles from the plantation where that sugar had been produced. The consumer might never see the plantation. They might never see the cane being cut. They might never encounter the people whose forced labor produced the sweetness on their table. Yet growing European demand for sugar helped make the plantation system increasingly profitable. This was one of the defining characteristics of the emerging global economy. Distance separated consumption from production. The farther the commodity traveled, the easier it could become to ignore the human conditions under which it had been produced. Once again, food was becoming part of an expanding imperial system. Tea and the global cup. Tea followed a different path. Originating in China, tea entered European markets during the 17th century through expanding Asian trade networks. The Dutch were among the earliest major European commercial traders in tea, while Britain eventually developed an enormous appetite for it. Tea became especially significant when combined with sugar. A European cup of sweetened tea could bring together tea from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean, European shipping and finance, and the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Few everyday objects better illustrated the new global economy. The cup sitting on a European table could represent thousands of miles of transportation and centuries of accumulated commercial knowledge. The consumer experienced a simple pleasure. Behind that pleasure stood an enormous system. This is one of the great transformations of the early modern period. Globalization entered the household. The oceans were no longer merely separating continents. They were connecting breakfast tables, coffee houses, kitchens and taverns to distant farms, plantations, ports and markets. Tobacco and the Americas. Tobacco added another dimension to this transformation. Native to the Americas, tobacco had been cultivated and used by indigenous peoples long before Europeans arrived. European observers encountered tobacco after the voyages of exploration and carried the plant back across the Atlantic. Smoking and other forms of tobacco consumption spread rapidly through Europe. Colonial governments quickly recognized its commercial value. Tobacco plantations developed in several parts of the Americas, including the English colonies of North America. Once again, a plant that had originated in one part of the world became an international commodity. And once again, its expansion depended heavily on labor systems that increasingly relied upon enslavement. The European appetite for tobacco, therefore, became another link in the growing Atlantic economy. Sugar, molasses and rum. Sugar also produced another important commodity. Rum. Molasses was a byproduct of sugar production. Rather than allowing it to go to waste, producers could ferment and distill it into alcohol. Rum became an important Atlantic trade good. Sugar plantations therefore produced more than sugar. They produced molasses. Molasses could become rum. Rum could be traded across the Atlantic. Ships could carry manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and plantation commodities from the Americas back toward Europe and North America. One crop could therefore generate multiple commodities and strengthen an entire commercial network. This is an important feature of mature economic systems. Waste becomes another product. The plantation economy became increasingly efficient at extracting value from land, crops and labor. But its efficiency came with an enormous human cost. A global European diet. By 1800, Europe was entering a new age of consumption. Sugar was becoming more affordable. Tea and coffee were reaching broader sections of society. Tobacco had become widespread. Spices, chocolate and other imported products had entered European culture. The European diet was becoming global. But globalization was not simply an exchange of foods between cultures. It was shaped by commerce, conquest, colonialism, slavery and unequal power. The foods and beverages of everyday European life increasingly connected ordinary households to distant places they would never see. Tea brought Asia into the European home. Sugar connected that tea to Caribbean and American plantations. Coffee connected European cities to tropical agriculture. Tobacco brought a crop from the Americas into European daily life. Spices connected European markets to the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Rum connected sugar plantations to an Atlantic economy. The world was becoming connected through food. But those connections came at an enormous human cost. Sugar and spice. Sugar and spice became symbols of European prosperity. Behind them stood ships, merchants, plantations and empires. And behind the plantations stood millions of people whose labor had been coerced, exploited, and, in the case of enslaved people, violently stolen. The European appetite for new flavors helped create one of the first truly global consumer economies. Europe's diet was no longer shaped only by what could be grown nearby. It was increasingly shaped by what could be transported across oceans. This changed more than what Europeans ate. It changed what Europeans expected. Sweetness could become ordinary. Tea could become a daily ritual. Coffee could become part of urban life. Tobacco could become a mass commodity. Spices that had once been rare could become increasingly accessible. The extraordinary was becoming ordinary. And that transformation carried a hidden geography. A European household could enjoy products from thousands of miles away without ever seeing the landscapes, ships, plantations, or people involved in producing them. The modern European taste for sweetness, spice, coffee, and tea was therefore not created in Europe alone. It was built across oceans. It was built through trade. It was built through technology and finance. It was built through empire. And, tragically, much of it was built through human suffering. The world was becoming one market, but it was not yet one society. Europe's new appetite had helped create a global economy. The next question was what that economy would do to Europe itself.